Excellent. So we will begin at 10:05, and I believe everybody's here, 34 people. So again, welcome. Thank you for your patience. My name is Alex Miller. I'm the acting team lead for Shelter and Settlements, and today we have been working with the Shelter Cluster to have a presentation and sharing what we've done and some new faces, as well as some new activities that we look forward to sharing with you in the coming months and next year. So next slide. So again, we're going to have to talk about meeting the team. We have a few new faces on the team here, and we'll introduce them just briefly. What is BHA? As many of you know, and many may not know, we have now combined to be the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, and this is FFP, which is Food for Peace, combining with OFDA, which is the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. So we're a bigger and more capacitated office to do food, emergency, and some in-betweens. We'll also introduce some new proposal guidelines. Since the middle of this year, we've introduced new guidelines for applications that involved all sectors, and we'll talk briefly about that. We'll also have some communication outreach. We're doing more communication externally as well as internally in the agency so that Shelter and Settlements is advocated more and understood by a wider audience, as well as touching upon the fiscal year 2020 as well as 21 next year, sector spending, a quick summary, and our team's activities, as well as common comments. We've had common comments paper for several years now, and those are the kind of consistent issues or comments or pieces of concern that we share with partners in their applications with their funding proposals. And we'll also preview our SNS team guidance notes. Next slide. Again, my name is Alex Miller. I'm a Shelter Acting Team Lead. We have Earl Kessler, Surge Shelter and Settlements Advisor. Just say hi, Earl.
Hi.
And of course, you'll know Chuck Setchell, our Senior Shelter and Settlements Hazard Mitigation Advisor.
How you doing?
And then we have Travis Betts, our Shelter and Settlements Advisor, who's half health, half shelter. And then we have Chris Lopez, our Program Assistant. Say hi, Chris.
Hi, everyone.
And then we have 3 additional Shelter and Settlements advisors planned, hopefully, for the next year. So keep an eye out for a bigger team. Next slide. And so what is BHA, or the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance? The USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance is the U.S. government lead coordinator for international disaster response and assistance. We reach tens of millions of people around the world with life-saving aid. And like I said, it was created this year. We've merged 2 offices to form quite a big office with many technical sectors working together, and only a USAID bureau that provides humanitarian aid and sets the foundations for long-term recovery. Next slide. And our mandate has not changed really that much. We still have the prerogative of saving lives. We alleviate human suffering. We reduce the impact of humanitarian crises. USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance provides life-saving humanitarian assistance, including food, water, shelter, settlements, emergency healthcare, sanitation, hygiene, and critical nutrition services to the world's most vulnerable and hardest to reach people. Next slide. And as I stated before, we have new proposal guidelines. They can be found on the USAID's, if you Google or internet search proposal application guidelines USAID BHA, you will find them. We have sector-specific links so that it's not a giant document to look through. And we have the deadline, which has passed, which starts our new application fiscal year, which is October 1st. So any applications submitted after this date will need to go by those deadlines, not the prior ones from the prior years. And this is applicable to next year as well as 2022. We always appreciate feedback, as we are always in a process of evolving and improving. So do let us know if there's anything that seems out of place or needs improvement with the application guidelines. Next. And like I said, also, we have more of an intention to advocate, communicate, and collaborate concerning shelter and settlements. This is internally, which is something we're trying to do more with other sectors since we're a bigger agency and office. We do advocate for it across many offices so that it's well understood and welcome. and thought of and appreciated. But many of you know we have the annual sector update. This has been going on for several years now. It provides a very quick snapshot of what we've been able to do, where we're at, and hopefully where we're going. We also have a quarterly newsletter, which will be internal. This will be helping our other offices and colleagues know what we're up to. And as well as the World Habitat Day. This is an example of where we'll be celebrating days of a year that coincide with what Shelter and Settlements is doing internally and externally. Next slide, please. Chuck, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks. This quick snapshot of our past work, 2019. We had, as a part of our kind of standalone shelter and settlements programs, a lot of support to particular NGOs as well as the Global Shelter Cluster, about $4 million, about $200 million for some of our interventions and support activities around the world, primarily in about 36 countries. We also supported academic partnerships and student fellowships, and really promoting the settlements approach as a platform for response in DRR. Next slide, Chris, please. So some of you may recall Lee Mullaney. He recently ended a contract, and at some point he might come back, but there's a picture of him hard at work in the field. In fiscal year 2020, we did some considerable sector spending. Several of these activities listed were in direct or indirect support of the Global Shelter Cluster. You'll see the shelter projects activity, the IEC materials, the working group on urban settlements, the diaspora and DRR project that we've had with IOM for a while now, that's kind of been connected to the working group on diaspora in the Global Shelter Cluster. We've also, as some of you may know, we've had for several years now a grad student fellowship that's generated quite a lot of interest in the professional and academic circles. Young junior grad students that have actually all of the 13 or so fellows that we've supported thus far are in some way, shape, or form involved in humanitarian shelter assistance. Next slide, please. And some of the activities that we've completed this last year and hope to continue and expand on in this next year: training, outreach, and advocacy, guidance on plastic sheeting and NFIs. We're moving with the working group, the Global Shelter Working Group, and trying to identify ways to reduce the use of plastic in packaging NFIs, for example. Also looking at new ways of producing plastic sheeting. Additional guidance on the structures keyword that's in our proposal. This has been a very provocative keyword, as it turns out. It's not directly applicable to shelter and settlements activities, but some of the other sectors. We've been reviewing health clinics, for example, and slaughterhouses and protection centers, etc. Again, the proposal guidelines, a roadmap for research that we're now working on through the Interaction Shelter and Settlements Working Group with Hilmi Mohammed. Very, very important work, and the wider impacts of shelter and settlements that Hilmi was involved in as well. I will say, with regard to training, we just learned yesterday, actually, from Hilmi, that our online shelter and settlements training program that's been in existence now for 5 years, we're seeing user participation rates that are very, very welcomed. Over 6,600 people have accessed the course. Of that, about a third have completed the course, or the equivalent of just over one person per day completing the course over the 5-year period. And those folks have come from 138 different countries. So we're getting the impression that one, there's some demand for training, and that hopefully we can be responsive. I also mentioned that the training is now available in 4 languages. So a very concerted effort we did over the last year and a half or so. Next slide. And I will hand this over to Earl Kessler, my colleague, to talk about the common comments and some of the other activities that we'll be engaging in this year.
Thank you, Chuck. Common comments are ways that we are able to try to clarify how we can move forward and to give heads up as to what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in the sense of a humanitarian response to a variety of different issues. The requirements that are laid out, the structures keyword, as Chuck mentioned, is one that it has implications for the degree to which building can occur, the standards that are applied, and the process through which it probably would be implemented. Ours being that there is an incremental beginning to most of this that allows us to proceed, to move, and to make the link between that which is humanitarian assistance and the development area. One of the other things that we like to emphasize is the whole issue of sphere project guidelines, that we are advocates of and adherents to those guidelines, and they provide then a legitimate basis for us to review proposals that come in, make recommendations as to how to proceed, and to really push the notion of coverage. Coverage becomes one of the critical issues, especially in shelter and settlements, and adherence to the sphere guidelines is one way to promote a more holistic, more numerically complete coverage of the demand and the need that appears after an event or in a conflict. BOQs and diagrams are ways that we can really technically review that which we do, and then we come up with this paint and cosmetic work. The whole issue about paint has been somewhat contentious in that while we all agree that we would love to be able to provide, you know, the most pleasant environment after we have done our work, frankly, it's cosmetic, and only in the instance where we have psychologically and politically impacts of statements and slogans left on walls by groups that are only traumatic to people who move back into the shelters that they occupy. Wood paint, 1 or 2 coats, 2-coat max is allowed, but it has to be really justified along the socio-political guidelines that otherwise paint and those other kind of cosmetic works really are not acceptable. The assistance to vulnerable groups, that's one of the other focuses that we promote. Many people have the same goal, but what it is to be able to make sure that we have the basis for us to be able to actually identify who those vulnerable groups are, how best to deal with them and approach them. Next slide, please. And so what we end up with is guidance notes. And guidance notes are those things where we have what we've really attempted to do is deconstruct the whole response mechanism so that there are individual components that we are able to clarify so that we end up with a common language. The common language is one that we would really like to promote so that it doesn't get so loose around different definitions because people understand different things in different ways. And for the funding that we will be able to provide, we would like to have a common basis of language, at least, to be able to properly review and then be able to approve those things that go forward. So our guidance notes really relate to humanitarian construction. What does that mean? NFI assistance in going through and finding ways other than through construction. But one of the things that we found is that there is a tendency to include components, especially plastic sheeting and NFI assistance, and frankly, that's not acceptable. And so what we're attempting to do is make sure at the beginning of what is and what will not be accepted, so that we don't have to go back with comments and then re-comments, and then people reconstruct or redesign their programs and the like. Then we have the whole notion of settlements and the guidance of what is a settlement, and looking at settlements holistically and inclusively allows us to be able to coordinate and support the coordination of other kinds of programs. If a settlement, if the built environment is a place, if the shelter is the place where other things can occur, then settlements is one way of really approaching that as an inclusive, holistic approach, that multi-sectoral, if you like, to be able to deal with those kinds of follow-on and support activities. Cash-based assistance. Cash-based assistance has become a modality that has become quite popular. It seems to be more inclusive. It respects the beneficiary to a point where they can decide how best to resolve their own priorities, and it needs to be technified in some ways. Cash-based assistance for shelter is not a great idea, and we really resist having shelter activities included in those, especially the plastic sheeting for roofing or other kind of improvements, if there is no training or technical assistance that goes beyond it. Coverage of identified needs, I've mentioned already. Coverage of identified needs is excuse me, is really a big issue. And what we need to be able to do is to use the resources that we have available to begin to address the greatest numbers in a way that really resolves the minimal habitable covered living space kind of criteria, so that we can address the bulk of the need as we can. And this requires that we have an information base, which is what the shelter opportunity surveys provide. Shelter opportunity surveys really give us the dimension of what it is that we need to carry out, so that we have a sense of, if we pick X amount, but we don't know how that relates to what the need is, then we're happy with that, but frankly, we're not doing our jobs. And so what we need to be able to do is establish what that need is, and then decide and devise the programming required to be able to begin to address what the bulk of that need is, especially looking at the issues of vulnerability, the most vulnerable, and being able to provide that kind of assistance. There will be issues that will come up, and we are more than happy to engage in conversations about what the guidance means. So if you have any questions about those, please feel free to ask. Over to you, Alex.
Great, thanks, Earl. And then next slide, I think we have some time for some questions, discussions, feedback, and I'll open up to the floor for anybody who might want to start things off. And again, we've covered, so please do. Yeah, go ahead, Joseph.
Well, sorry. Hi. Thanks for the presentation and for the update of the scope. It's great, and it's good to be clear. Only all donors were like that. I was just wondering, in terms of how far down the line we can go. So, for example, something like HLP, which I think is one of the development outcomes of a shelter program. Like, when does it stop being within scope, or is there any kind of tips on how to advise missions on whether to say, look, this is going too far for BHA funding. This is just about the right level. I don't know if that makes sense, but there's some key kind of simple questions they can say, like, actually, no, that's going too much into development assistance. This is too much. This is kind of more within scope.
I can start that off, and then Chuck and Earl, please do fill in. I think with HLP, it can very much go into that developmental phase, that long-term recovery, because it applies to the systems of a context, the longer term, really agreements to what a community has and what's agreed upon for tenure. But when we, as a sector here in BHA, we do try to adhere as much as possible. Pretty much a requirement is to keep that in that emergency phase, and what that means for HLP, and the best way I can describe it in the time that we have is what can HLP do right now to save lives? What policy or program links can it make to the systems that can be taken on afterwards? What can we do right now to secure an agreed upon tenure, agreed upon community action plan to make sure that people can inhabit that place? As you know, IOM and USA has been working on discussions for the past few months on HLP, and right now those work papers, those awards that we're currently with the Global Shelter Cluster are really meant to intend to define that and make sure that we do not go into it. But I'll hand it over to Earl or Chuck to further discuss that.
Yeah, this is Earl. Joseph, we just came off of another conversation about Afghanistan and HLP issues and women in Afghanistan and tenure rights and all the rest. And what for me it really related to the emergency phase is really the occupancy issue. If you can guarantee occupancy, then you have been able to initiate a process that would carry you into much more legalistic kinds of things if you have to do that. But if instead of looking for land title, if you look for occupancy certificates or ways of generating those kinds of things, that seems to be much more of a humanitarian response to HLP than trying to have the lawyers decide if you can provide title to the properties that you think you're working on. There may be instances where in fact you can, and that there may be people who have land title who are offering their land for IDPs and others to settle upon, and that's another issue. But in terms of the individual family, it would seem that the occupancy issue is the one that would be the guidance for the humanitarian phase of recovery. Over.
I would, this is Chuck, I would add, Joseph, that the recognition of occupancy is critical to the provision of humanitarian assistance in any sector. And humanitarian actors are actually pretty good at triangulating who has lived where, when, through a community engagement process. So the recognition of occupancy is the first step in kind of formalizing the informal nature of most agreements and land and house relations that we see. We actually codified the recognition of occupancy in some of our early work in Afghanistan years ago with a memoranda of agreement between USAID and the Kabul municipality and our implementing partner, which at the time was CARE, to recognize this occupancy of beneficiaries for an extended period of time. And that has worked out actually quite well and can serve, I think, as a model for other activities going forward. Over.
Thanks. Sorry, just to chip in, I think just that example of the way you work directly with the municipality of Kabul is, I think, something I really appreciate by working with OFDA, or sorry, BHA now, in that when you deploy, you kind of help, you're not just a donor, you help negotiate access and help negotiate solutions, which I think is really, really useful. And I think I'd encourage other people on the call when they meet you in the field, not just to talk to you about money, but to see how you can leverage your position to get better kind of solutions, strategies, and access. So thanks.
Sure, thanks. Couple of questions in the chat, Eric talk more about possible change with plastic sheeting. We are in the process of, as you know, we have marked, we have unmarked sheeting. We have rolls. We've had rolls for years. We're now also going to be stocking tarpaulins, 4x6 meter. We'll also be looking at the longevity of sheeting and the kind of biodegradable prospects of sheeting, as sheeting, as you know, is sometimes ends up in all kinds of different places. So we're looking at the environmental aspect of not just the packaging of sheeting and NFIs, but also the sheeting itself. Really at the front end of this conversation with some institutions, and we're looking forward to some of the research that is generated. And I think I'll take one stab here, and others can go ahead. Also curious about sphere, habitable space, BHA, urban context. I think this gets back to what Earl had mentioned earlier, this issue of coverage. We're interested in knowing the universe of need, what is the denominator, if you will, of need, and how well we're doing as a sector or cluster in addressing that need. As you know, we're probably operating at 20 to 25% coverage rates in most responses. We need to make sure that available resources are spread as widely as we can, recognizing the basic sphere metrics. So understood that urban context might be different. They can go either way, actually, up or down from the basic metric of sphere. But we're cognizant of that, but also very cognizant of this issue of coverage. We're going to be addressing this and want to enlist everyone on the call and elsewhere to focus on coverage and as a means of demanding resources, so that we can increase. We should all have a goal of doubling or tripling the output that we have now. Coverage rates are actually quite low.
Chuck,
Alex, over to you.
Chuck, one other
Earl?
thing. Yeah. There's two issues. One is there are going to be issues that are going to come up, and one of the big issues is the tendency to move towards a more durable solution, and that really will impact the coverage issue tremendously. I think for us, BHA, we're going to resist as we can this quest to provide much more permanent shelter. It's not something that's going to help us in the coverage area, and it's certainly not going to really help in the numbers that are going to be provided, because the cost per unit is going to be escalating to a point where it's going to be prohibitive. The other issue is that once we begin, the political nature of more durable has not yet really been discussed. And what I'm referring to is that, as we know, sometimes those who are destined for units that we hope will be useful and helpful to them don't end up there because they have been taken over by somebody else, or some other group has come in and said, thank you very much, and they move in. The more finished the unit becomes, the more risk there is in really having those units taken over by people that not necessarily need them the most. And I think if we stick to our most vulnerable and the minimal habitable area that we have, then I think that's going to be the goals, and that's going to be the direction that we would really like to move in. Over.
Eric, I hope that answered your question. Ella, your question, in addition to the plastic packaging initiative mentioned, do you have any further initiatives to promote the green agenda in the coming years? And how can GSC or shelter actors engage with that? So because we have a combination of FFP now, they have done considerable investment and research now into greener packaging for food, but also what does that mean for, as Earl, sorry, not Earl, Chuck stated, more biodegradable plastic, and how and how initiatives similar to that, such as UNHCR's recycle plastic sheeting, where it's brought back and reused. We look at other initiatives that really we look to the partners to minimize the carbon footprint, the transportation distances. It's really valuable to know what partners are thinking about how much energy it takes to transport, to build, to construct, to ship. We really think about localization in the aspect of environmental respectability and conserving energy. We also think about what materials are being used in the house's construction. Are we using motor oil for treatment of posts in the ground? Are we using some other alternative? What are we doing with the sites that have been used to treat bamboo? Many of these things are really upon the partner to think and to showcase what is being saved. Even having more local staff saves a lot of greener carbon dioxide in terms of travel. Having more local hands-on, travel less distances. I mean, everything counts to adhere to the green agenda.
Alex, one other thing I would like to add is to the green agenda. It's not just the shelter that needs to be really reviewed and looked at. It's the settlement design and plan itself. How the settlements are laid out is a challenge. And I think we really need to look at very, very carefully how settlement design can facilitate not only environmental improvement by site selection and those kinds of criteria, but also in the design of the settlement itself that facilitates the other kinds of programs that settlements can enhance. If you're speaking about protection, if you're speaking about child-safe areas, if you're speaking about distribution of foods, if you're speaking about any of those kinds of improvements, or the settlement design makes a big difference. And there are issues that relate to settlement design that we at BHA is really beginning to look at, and we would welcome anybody else who would be interested in working with us, because there are clusters, there are issues. The grid doesn't have to be the sole solution. The context of how the site is selected, what it does with the contours, all those kinds of other kinds of things have environmental implications that are really very strong. The lot size, if you're really looking at how shelters are placed on a lot and you think that livelihood is an issue, well, then it's going to be the plot size that's going to influence how livelihood can enhance what will happen either within the shelter or around the shelter to be able to facilitate livelihood activities. But settlement design also has environmental impacts, and I think that that's something that has been really not been a focus of much attention. Over.
I'll just add one point. We've done some basic back of the envelope calculations for camp expansion in Syria, and utilizing some basic metrics related that are embedded in the Sphere project, and some design criteria. We've been able to reduce the footprint of transitional settlements or camps by 1/4 over the kind of conventional design and large-scale metrics of camps. So think about, in terms of a green agenda, reducing the footprint of activity by 3/4. So that in itself is very substantial. And some of the other elements that Earl talked about as well, very substantial. So we're not looking just at NFIs, for looking at a kind of a relationship to a green agenda or cost savings, but also the basic approach to the sector. Over.
And I would just add, before we move to the next question, that Antonella had a great point about circular economy. I think when we use materials, as many of us know on this call, the materials make jobs, and the jobs fuel recovery, but also those materials can continue to make jobs. So for instance, bamboo can be planted, harvested, sold, built with plant, harvested, sold, etc. That includes projects where you probably should verify where you're getting your wood. If a refugee camp needs transitional shelters, it would be very good of the partner to verify that this is not coming from a country that should not be selling its timber, for example. So that cost analysis, that risk analysis for environmental impact is always welcome. And it really is on behest of partners on the ground to follow through with that. I'll just follow up with the next question with Renee. Can you say more about the NFI guidance that is proposed? There may be some synergies with the Global Shelter Cluster NFI Working Group. Earl, you've been working on this quite much. Would you like to step in?
Well, the NFI, I haven't. Thank you, Alex. The whole issue is what do we include in the packages, the distribution of a kit that would comprise the NFI donation or support. The fact that we're really trying to make it so that it relates to things that families need to carry out daily living activities, the blankets, the mattresses, the kitchen equipment, those kinds of things. Those are the NFIs that really would be essential. It's not construction materials, because the construction materials, once again, are those things that relate to training on how well or badly they're being used, whether they're going to, if they're used badly, then how frequently will you have to replace them? I think it's the loss and best use of resources that the NFIs really require is the way to justify the composition of an NFI kit. And so therefore, we have the subsector of shelter that when we receive proposals that have building materials included, especially plastic sheeting, we say, no, this is not an NFI, but if you wish to do this, then you need to present certain kinds of bills of quantity, you have to do plans, you have to show who's going to do this, how is the training is there training needed? Are the skills levels sufficient so that you have a labor force that actually can install and apply plastic sheeting, for instance? And we have, as part of the information that has been generated by the office, and Chuck can talk more about this than I, is the proper ways of installing some of these things, especially the plastic sheeting, so that in typhoon areas or hurricane areas or whatever, that things just don't blow away or get destroyed very, very quickly. Over.
Maybe we have one more question. I don't know how we're doing for time, but Tonya has an interesting question about durability. And I think one of the things that we stress is that nearly all of the people that we respond to are engaged prior to a disaster or crisis, are engaged in an incremental process of housing and land development. And what we hope to do as humanitarians is to re-immerse people, affected populations, back into the processes that they were involved in prior to the disaster or crisis event. So what we're trying to do is incrementally provide assistance, set them up with an appropriate platform for response and longer term recovery, and doing so with incrementalism in mind. So the more robust output of the humanitarian sector can be something called transitional shelter and settlements activities, actually. So how do we link humanitarian assistance with this incremental development process? That's the question going forward. And I think, again, it links to the larger issue of coverage, the availability of resources and capacities and expertise. Over.
Chuck, one last thing, and then I'll be quiet. One of the other things that really I think is important coming up right now are the issues that are coming out of conflict areas. And what we're looking at is middle income countries have events to which then we need to respond. And the whole idea of repair and improvement of flats, for instance, is a very different issue to informal settlement repair and improvement. And I think there's not enough work that has yet been going. We don't even have an information base about availability of units to be able to provide shelter in pre-existing situations that may require repair, so that the land issue doesn't overwhelm us as to not having enough land to accommodate all the different IDPs and the refugees or whatever it is, and the IDPs that we deal with. But the middle income country issue is a set of problems. The Beirut explosion, for instance, Syria, the conflicts in Syria, Iraq, a lot of these areas that are or were middle income countries need to have some thought put into them so that those resources are identified and that they are seen as resources and not liabilities. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Earl. Does anybody have any more questions? And if not, then I guess we could wrap it up. Okay. All right, great. Well, thank you again, Shelter Cluster, for allowing us to have this time to present an update where we're at as an agency and a sector and team. Of course, please reach out to us. If you'd like our emails, please type it in the chat and we can share it with you. But again, thank you, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the week. Take care.